You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Janusz Patkowski. Dr. Patkowski is a research scientist at the MIT EAPS Department Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Science. Dr. Patkowski's research is focused on finding life on exoplanets, biosignature gases, and theoretical biochemistry. He is a co-author on the 2 papers detailing the discovery of phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus, as well as determining that the phosphine on Venus cannot be explained by conventional processes.
Anna, help me with something. Ich bin ein Berliner. Did John F. Kennedy get that wrong? Some say he was actually talking about a jelly donut. Some say he wasn't.
Well, let's figure it out. And I know the best way to do so. With Babbel, today's sponsor. Babbel's award-winning technology is scientifically proven to get you speaking another language in just a few weeks. And with how hectic things have been lately, focusing on some self-improvement like learning a new language is a great way to refocus the start of 2022 for you. So if you want to learn German, also Guten Tag to all our German viewers, you can use Babbel's multiple ways of learning to do so.
I like how the lessons are done by actual people speaking the language, real language teachers. In other words, no AI or algorithms.
Oh, point taken, John. Also, look here. They have short interactive lessons, including podcasts, games, and even live classes with top teachers, which allows someone like you with a busy schedule to jump in and out of the app.
Okay, so I need everyone watching or listening right now to do me a favor. Help me find out if JFK was talking about jelly donuts or not. So click the link in the description below to get 65% off your Babbel subscription. Let me know what you learned in any of the languages you chose to learn in the comments below. And we're back with Dr. Janusz Patkowski. Now, one glaring thing about the idea of how life on Earth came about that makes us look a little bit different so far as we know. Now, granted, we haven't really found very much evidence yet for how prevalent exomoons are, although there are people working on that. But our moon, the great glancing blow where we ended up with this almost double planet system that we have, and that the moon seems to, one can come up with ways that the moon aided in the development and genesis of life on Earth from, abiogenesis. The moon, how important do you think that is?
So people tend to actually ascribe a great importance to the moon, and of course, I do not blame anybody. I mean, it's a predominant object on our night sky, but we do not really know how. And this might be a little bit of a controversial point of view. We do not really know how important it really is. It's again like with every other characteristic of our solar system, we can ascribe importance to it, how important it was for the origin of life or its persistence over billions of years on Earth. But unfortunately, we do not know yet how really formative it was for life or for life's origin or for life's persistence over billions of years. Now, with that said, of course, the reasons why the large moon, like our moon, might be important, predominantly because it actually stabilizes the axial tilt of our planet. And that in turn actually stabilizes the climate quite significantly. So we do not have these huge variations in climate as we could have had if we didn't have this moon. But of course, there is a question there. Is this really deal breaker if one doesn't have a big moon to stabilize the climate or stabilize the planetary axis? So basically, there were also studies on the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, or the argument of on the importance of the moon, is that in certain cases the stabilization of an axis might actually be a problem. And of course, people will still argue about this. So I do not want to sound like this is a settled issue. But imagine that, for example, through some unfortunate climactic event, our planet or any other planet, it's a habitable planet, actually became an ice ball Earth, or this so-called snowball Earth. Such events happened in the geological history of our planet, and it is actually suggested that the presence of a large moon and with its climate stabilizing properties actually makes the escaping from that snowball Earth scenario a little bit more difficult. So you might actually also make a case, of course people will argue about this, and I mean, of course, this might not be the most probable scenario, but it is nonetheless, that there are also some negatives of having large moon when it comes to actually persistence of a biosphere or a complex biosphere on a planet, because obviously our life had to survive these rather disastrous events, and not even one, but at least twice of the snowball Earth, which we thankfully escaped from. Now, there is also a question of the importance of the moon to the origin of life. We unfortunately do not know where life originated, or what chemical reactions actually really led to the formation of life, and we do not even know what environment life really originated on Earth. There are essentially two different camps that fight with each other. Maybe they shouldn't actually, but they fight with each other. One camp actually postulate that life originated in a small pools of water on the surface of the planet, which actually periodically dried and then got wetted again. And the other group actually postulated that life originated on the bottom of an ocean in the hydrothermal vent systems, and specifically most likely in the alkaline hydrothermal vent systems. So why we are actually looking at the origin of life scenarios and the moon? Because you might actually speculate that if having a large moon actually also helps with these fluvial effects, or if I call it correctly, essentially you can nicely have these cycles of wetting and drying thanks to the moon as well. So you can flood an area, and then you can actually withdraw this water quite nicely. So it might actually help in this cycling that is quite needed, of this wet-dry cycle, so to speak, when it comes to the origin of life scenario in these shallow pools on the surface of the planet. If, on the other hand, if life really originated on the bottom of the planet, then the large moon might not be that important. So definitely there are reasons to believe that the large moon is actually important, but we really don't know if it is actually crucial. If we find life on Mars, or if we find some peculiar life in the clouds of Venus, for example, then we might actually, then we will have a solution. And if this life actually is a completely different life than our own life, then we have a solution to this question. And the moon is not really that a crucial factor in the origin and persistence of the biosphere.
Now, a further key here would be Enceladus and Europa, because if you were to find an independent occurrence of life on either of those ice shell moons or any of the other many ice shell moons in our solar system, then that tells you hydrothermal vent, right?
That tells you something much more than only the importance of the moon. It tells you also, it constrains the environment for origin of life, because it automatically means that life could originate, if it indeed originated there and not got brought there, and not brought there from some other planet on it actually that actually had a dry land. That indeed the hydrothermal vent scenario is the place for the origin of life. And we might go ahead of ourselves a little bit in the discussion here But there is some recent geological work done that suggests that very early in its history, Earth actually was an ocean world. So it was an ocean planet where there was no dry land, or this dry land was extremely scarce. This is, of course, by no means a settled science, but if indeed these novel papers or novel studies are true, then this is definitely a huge boost to the so-called hydrothermal vent, alkaline hydrothermal vent, or any hydrothermal vent origin of life scenario that people consider. And this would mean that the shallow, wet-dry cycles and so on are not really the place in which life actually likely originated. Of course, people argue also that it might very well be that life originated on Mars and then got brought up to Earth, because Mars never had such a global ocean. So if indeed life, for example, originated on Mars, then the question for wet-dry, are they really wet-dry cycles, or are they hydrothermal vents? Well, it's probably still open. But if we actually find life on Europa, and this is a unique life, that it's a European life, or Europa's life, then it's then the environment in which life's origin is most likely settled.
I think what would be most interesting is if both answers were correct, and then it can happen two ways.
That's another fantastic possibility, because so I do not really study origin of life myself, but I tend to observe the arguments of both sides, and they are really heated, I would say. Those two camps, they really have completely different views, and they do not really talk to each other that much. And maybe they should, because from open discussion and actually a marketplace of ideas, the only good things can happen, essentially, and progress is made. So, but that's actually true. What if you actually have multiple paths for origin of life? We have no idea. Maybe you do. One extremely peculiar possibility that was also explored since the early 70s, I presume, is that what if life could actually originate in an atmosphere on Earth, within the certain aerosols and clouds and so on. So this is still, a little bit forgotten ideas, but there is a lot of interesting chemistry going on in the actual cloud aerosols on Earth as well. And people were exploring the possibility that certain building blocks for life actually got formed on the surface because of the surface chemistry effects in the cloud aerosols. So this is a rather peculiar environment for life's origin, but nevertheless it was considered. There were also some scenarios in which people also discussed the possibility of origin of life in some periodical freezing scenarios, in which you actually have origin of life in ice, within the ice structures as well. So definitely those two scenarios in which you actually have the hydrothermal vent systems on the bottom of the ocean, and the wet-dry cycles on the little pools on the surface of the planets are the predominant ones. But of course, at least in principle, possibilities are much more diverse. We don't know which of those possibilities are really led to the formation of life on Earth, and we don't even know. Maybe there are certain chemical reactions that needed to happen on the surface, and certain others needed to happen on the bottom of the sea in the hydrothermal system, and then actually the life came together because of these two environments actually working together. This might be also a possibility. Until we find the other example of life elsewhere, we probably are going to still vigorously argue about the environmental constraints of the origin of life.
Now, this takes us closer to a related question that takes us closer to asking questions about life on Venus. Plate tectonics and its role and the carbon cycle's role in life on Earth. Now, Venus does not appear to have this going on, neither does Mars, but yet both they're candidates for having microbial life. So how important, in your view, is plate tectonics to the question of where life can occur?
Personally, don't think that it is absolutely required. With one little caveat, I think that the planet that is geologically dead is much less habitable, if at all. But a plate tectonics itself, it might not be absolutely required for life. You need some sort of cycling, as you mentioned, like the carbon cycle, or you need some sort of cycling of elements, which plate tectonics is a fantastic source of. But other possibilities comes to mind, and the hydrothermal systems is one. For example, if you have an ocean, like for example you have on Europa or Enceladus, but volcanism is another. Volcanism is likely a sufficient cycling, so to speak, a mechanism to provide a planet with this habitability constraint. The reason why I think so, and of course there might be some geologists that are vigorously going to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, is that even in the history of life on Earth, we know that likely we didn't have plate tectonics and nothing, and our life didn't get extinct or didn't even went close to extinction because of that. So the example of that is the so-called, there is a period in the history of life on Earth, which is so-called boring billion. It's like a billion of years that actually, that people often call like nothing happens because the biosphere is kind of boring and the geology is boring and so on. And people actually assume or postulate that this was a time when there was not so much geological movement, that the plate tectonics was actually not present or was much less predominant. If plate tectonics was that important for the continuous persistence of life on Earth, then this type of boring billion periods in our own geological history we would expect this to be more dramatic in the geological record in terms of the persistence of our own biosphere. This doesn't appear to be the case. I think that having an active volcanism is important. Plate tectonics definitely helps, but as long as the sufficient cycling is provided, a cycling of elements and so on is provided, it's probably going to be fine.
Now, the natural question that people are going to ask here now is a sort of an elephant in the room: magnetic fields. Earth has a protective magnetic field. Mars has not much of anything, and Venus borrows something from the sun, but it's not too much. Now, specifically in regards to Venus, without an appreciable magnetic field, yet it still seems to have a potential for a microbial biosphere. How important are magnetic fields here? Do you have to have one at some point for life to arise, and then it can adapt without it, or can you do it without ever having it? Now, we have to caveat this. In that Venus and Mars may once have had them. We don't know. So
we don't know. And the answer for that point is that I absolutely don't know. Maybe somebody in the audience, maybe viewers know the answer to this question, how important the magnetic field really is. And again, this is like with the other points that we actually discussed today. We have to sort of decouple the importance for magnetic field, the apparent importance for magnetic field for our own planet today, or life as we have today, because we always can come up with the reasons why magnetic field would be that important and so on. But we have to sort of try to think if this is an absolute general requirement. People, for example, say that because of the magnetic field is lost on Mars, then essentially this made Martian atmospheric loss much more severe. But Mars is small in general, so it actually couldn't hold its own atmosphere that efficiently. We know now that Venus doesn't have magnetic field like Earth has, but yet its atmosphere is, of course, quite dense, much denser than ours. So from our own solar system, we already know that magnetic field, for example, is not absolutely required to retain an atmosphere. And there are some studies that actually suggest that in certain cases, because of the because how the magnetic field is arranged. It protects from the solar wind, but it also channels certain particles in a way that it actually can can increase the atmospheric loss and so on. So even in itself, this is a complex issue. And I must admit that, and I will be extremely honest here, I have no idea how really important magnetic field is on the origin of life or its persistence over billions of years. And I think that people simply have multiple opinions on this topic. I'm sure that people who study planetary magnetic fields will come up with a much more educated solution or answer to this question than I do. But I don't think that this is a deal breaker for an origin of life, or even for life's persistence on the planet.
Now, atmospheric pressure. This has changed with Earth, and it's changed with Venus, and it's changed with Mars. What role might that play in abiogenesis? I mean, can severe atmospheric pressure shut that process down insofar as what we understand from it?
This is a very good question. I would actually connect this question with atmospheric pressure and also atmospheric composition, because it's a hotly debated topic. What is the optimal atmospheric composition, atmospheric pressure for the origin of life, and atmospheric composition predominantly, for example. We now speculate or hypothesize that indeed for origin of life, what we need is a slightly reduced atmosphere, as chemists call it. So atmosphere that, for example, contains much more reduced molecules, so molecules that contain hydrogen. Let's say colloquially speaking or generally speaking. There are scenarios in the origin of life field that suggest that this type of atmospheric composition is actually extremely important. Does it have to be thick, or that this pressure has to be thick or thin, or what is the boundary here? Definitely the planet has to have an atmosphere. We cannot imagine a life on a planet in which, unless we speak about a planet that is permanently protected from the outside elements and various radiation by the thick ice of shell, for example, just like Enceladus or Europa moons. But we need an atmosphere. We need a certain thickness. This allows also for the protection from the UV light or from the various other types of radiation that our planet is going to be bombarded with. So there is certain thickness that is definitely useful for life or for its origin. We still don't know, for example, if the UV light is a detriment for life's origin, or it's actually required. And this again, I might get a heated debate in the comments section, because there are my colleagues, for example, Dr. Sukrit Ranjar and Dr. Paul Rimmer, they study the importance of the UV light and its penetration through the atmosphere of the planet, and how this actually affects the chemical reaction that could lead to the formation of crucial molecules on the planet, and like, for example, various nucleotides. And they tend to argue that the UV light is actually a beneficial factor in the formation of those molecules, and at the same time, by extension, the formation of life. Of course, the hydrothermal vent people would say that UV light is actually not beneficial, because for the life to originate, you need the hydrothermal vent system, so the UV and the surface and the sunlight is not necessarily that important. And therefore, maybe even the protection of the atmospheric of the sufficiently thick atmosphere is not that required. But so it's an open question. It cannot be too thick, because obviously then your planet might be actually a little bit too hot. If like, for example, we had a situation when you have like an exovenus that has this multiple bars or 90 bars or so of carbon dioxide, it would still be much too hot. But then we can always argue that we could move the planetary habitable zone for those planets a little further away from the sun, and who knows, maybe then these planets would be more habitable. So there is definitely, again, a parameter space. Like with every topic or every point that we are now discussing or speculating about, there is a parameter space. I would even argue that, and this is again a very quite speculative statement, that again, habitability is something to be explored. It's not a set in stone set of rules, because you might find a path to make a planet habitable, even if from our point of view it would not be, if it, for example, was substituted on the place of Earth. Like, for example, these planets that have thicker atmospheres with a little bit more carbon dioxide, so not a little bit, but quite a more carbon dioxide, might be more habitable if they, for example, are further away from the host star. So they have their own, so to speak, special habitable zone. So there is a lot of parameters here that actually come into play. As we are going to study the galaxy and study exoplanets and study other solar systems with hopefully the great help of James Webb Telescope, we will know more about the menagerie and the diversity of planetary atmospheres, and also hopefully about their composition. And that would give us more idea how unique also our atmosphere really is. Because from now on, I mean, from the point of view of our current knowledge, it is pretty unique, because, well, 20% of it, so to speak, is actually thanks to the life's activities. So it is a pretty unique situation. But we will see how diverse planetary atmospheres really are once the James Webb Telescope is actually coming online, hopefully soon.
Now, back to ultraviolet. Now, it's been suggested too, especially at Venus, because there is a great mystery here of the possibility that life could use ultraviolet as an energy source and as a power source, and that could be what's responsible for the highly mysterious ultraviolet absorber, the unknown ultraviolet absorber in the atmosphere of Venus that's been noted since the 1930s, that something, and we don't know what, some process, perhaps biological, is absorbing UV in the atmosphere of Venus.
Yes, I mean, that is something that people were speculated for quite a long time. The UV light is, of course, quite difficult to harness as an energy source, but I would think that it's probably not impossible to do. If there were recent papers actually from I think a group of Professor Patel that suggests that the Venusian UV environment is actually not that detrimental for life as we know it. Of course, they had to compare it to the survivability of our own life. If there is anything living in the Venusian clouds, it's of course not going to be life as we know it here on Earth, but nevertheless it is. It is conceivable to assume that life could evolve and adapt to actually using lights of different wavelength, as long as they carry enough energy in them to actually run their various metabolisms, various biochemical processes, and not only carbon fixation. And we touched on that topic in many other interviews as well. But it is quite important to point out that life doesn't necessarily have to use light as a driving force for carbon fixation exclusively. There might be actually some other solutions to various other chemical reactions that life has to perform, and uses energy of the sun in various wavelengths for that to make that happen. So I definitely do not exclude the possibility that this is that there is something that uses the UV light as a source. There is as a source of energy, or the UV absorber is essentially some sort of, if this is something biological, and of course this is hypothetical, or it might actually be simply a protective pigment that actually protects from the said effects of the UV light, because it might very well be there are all kinds of protective pigments even here on Earth, where there are various melanins of various types that, for example, do this rather well, and they are always exactly they have various dark colors, either black, brown, or even violet, which would, of course, rather superficially fit also this type of description of the UV absorber. So there are many possibilities here as well. I would not exclude the possibility of life actually using UV light as a source of energy to actually run some sort of exotic part of its own metabolism.
Should, and this is getting speculative, should the unknown UV absorber be determined to be of biological origin, does this become a biosignature that we can look for with exoplanets similar to Venus, exovenuses?
Oh, can we detect a UV absorber like that?
At great distance.
At this level of technology, I don't think that we can. I don't think, but this is actually an interesting question, and I didn't research it very thoroughly. I know that it might actually be, it probably is too challenging for us to do this with the technology that we have currently or that we plan to have. But again, I might be mistaken here, because I actually do not, this is a good question. I didn't actually think about, there were some theoretical studies how to detect clouds, how to even detect aerosols from exoplanets. I didn't read those in details, now I regret. And maybe, and who knows, maybe if those aerosols in some way absorb UV, can we actually do that? Yeah, that's a very good question. I do not have a ready answer. I do not want to mislead our viewers in any way.
General Fermi paradox question. Gut feeling, what do you think the solution is? Do you think that it's that intelligence is simply rare and that we may find biosignatures all over, but not technosignatures so much? Or do you think that it's just a shot in the dark and we can't even begin to approach trying to answer the question?
So this is my highly speculative, of course, take on the issue. But I think that life itself as a phenomenon is not rare. And I think it's actually, and this is of course speculative and people can have a different opinion, but I think that this is an inevitable consequence of a planetary formation, and as long as certain conditions are met. And what those conditions are is that essentially you need an input of energy, you need some sort of precursors for complex chemistry building, and you need some sort of solvent for these chemicals to be dissolved in, and for this as a medium for reactions to happen that lead eventually to more complex molecules. Now, I think, and this is my personal opinion, that even water is probably not the only solution for the origin of life. Because once you actually come up with some chemical system that can undergo Darwinian evolution, then you automatically would select for those chemicals, chemical systems, chemical genetic polymers or whatnot, that leave the highest number of fertile, so to speak, offspring. Yes. So once evolution kicks in, the entire planet eventually is going to be conquered by this life. And as long as these chemical reactions that lead to the formation of some sort of genetic polymer and Darwinian evolution and Darwinian system like that, as long as you have these conditions that allow this, you are going to have life. This might happen, of course, in water, and this probably might happen also in other solvents, maybe less likely in the cold ones, because the solubility limit is actually tremendous. Like, for example, methane lakes or seas on Titan might actually be a difficult environment for origin of life because of the solubility limits. So not necessarily the fact that chemical reactions are going to be slower and so on, but the solubility limit is something that is quite difficult. We have complex molecules, like complex proteins, that nevertheless are soluble in water. Yes, they are large and they are still soluble. They can act and react with each other. They can get transported in this liquid medium quite nicely. They do not precipitate out of the solution. Of course, they do, but I mean, they are generally quite soluble as well. In such a low temperatures, you have this limit of solubility, which might be actually a physical limit for that is very difficult to get around. But there are other solvents that allow this, apart from water, that allowed origin of life potentially, like for example this sulfuric acid, that it's such an unwelcoming solvent for our own biochemistry, but as our own research even showed, it actually could lead to a very, very interesting and complex chemistry, which is actually even quite colorful, and colorful literally, red, yellow, and so on, of various complicated polymers, and even as the very, very nice chapter in our work as well, done by Dr. Daniel Dusdevich from Harvard, from Professor Jack Szostak lab, even a formation of various vesicle-like structures with lipids that are, of course, not lipids like we have here on Earth, different ones, but still the same sort of solutions for problems that life has, but in an environment that is completely different. Yes, because it's not water, it's sulfuric acid. So it's essentially, of course, these are very preliminary results that we have, but they open the avenue for a rich diversity of chemistry that could happen in very, very different planetary environments. Not only the watery planet that we have here on Earth, but maybe other planetary environments as well, like for example this Venusian peculiar cloud environment. So origin of life itself, I think, might not even be a bottleneck, might not be the classical great filter, might not be a classical Fermi paradox reason. What I actually think is the evolution of technological intelligence. Maybe even complex life, but we know that complex life, by multicellular life at least, also originated multiple times. So this might not actually be a bottleneck as well, but the technological intelligence probably is, because we still don't know exactly what potential evolutionary jumps would have to be accomplished simultaneously, for example, for this technological intelligence to be actually a gradual evolutionary adaptation that is actually always beneficial. We have to remind ourselves that our brains take a lot of energy as they work. Yes, so this is actually a huge problem. If you want to cut your energy expenditure, then this is an obvious adaptation. And if this doesn't really affect overall performance as an organism in terms of living fertile offspring, then why to bother having an organ that is actually extremely expensive in its maintenance? So I think that the technological civilization is something that is the reason why we have the so-called great silence and why we actually have the Fermi paradox, and that the great filter is ahead of, I hope, and I'm an optimist also, I hope that the viewers allow me to become an optimist here. I think that the great filter is behind us, at least the biggest one, which is the evolutionary bottleneck of creating technological civilization. There might be some other bottlenecks ahead of us, like, for example, are we able to survive long enough and so on, but I don't think that these are the biggest ones. People often ask if there are some other reasons for Fermi paradox, like the so-called sociological ones, like, for example, the zoo hypothesis or the hypothesis, various other sociological, I call them sociological hypotheses that suggest that everybody is sort of following up, like everybody there out there in the galaxy, every civilization or the major players in the galaxy scheme are sort of treating us as some sort of, or having like some sort of, blockade over us, informational blockade. I don't think that this is a reasonable explanation for the Fermi paradox. And the reason for that is that you would expect, for this to work, you would expect every member of this species that has this blockade or this zoo to behave in exactly the same way all the time, over a very long time, over a very long period of time, and never ever leave any trace of any kind of visits or meddling in our affairs. Yes, if anything of our psychology, our human psychology, tells us is that we are very inquisitive, or we are interested in the world around us. So I don't believe that our species, that other species in the galaxy that are intelligent, are suddenly not going to be interested in various species elsewhere in the galaxy and in us in specifically. There will be always at least somebody who is going to be interested in studying some random planet like Earth in the galaxy for some reason. And that's why I don't believe that this sort of sociological explanation of the zoo hypothesis or some other hypothesis of this sort are a good explanation. But of course, I welcome any discussion on that regard as well.
I often wonder if it's really just a matter that civilizations are more discrete than we expect them to be. We always looked at them in the sense of Kardashev type super civilizations and things like that. But maybe, see, we aren't that, and we aren't really moving towards that. Do we have any plans to build a giant Kilconian Morrison type beacon to, blast out radio waves into the galaxy saying hello for thousands of years? No, we have no plans for that. And no one may ever. So it may be.
And no one may ever. Yes, and I mean, while there is an obvious, let's say, from our point of view of 21st century, an obvious theoretical advantage to building a Dyson swarm. Yes, I mean, we should technically call it probably a Dyson swarm instead of the Dyson sphere. Yes, we know that the building such structures might be beneficial. Maybe there is something that makes them extremely unlikely to happen. Like, for example, maybe there is some prohibitive cost that we actually do not yet realize that it is. So I think that we are too early on our path towards the stars, and dare I say it, galactic domination, to really actually know what sits in the minds of other super advanced civilization. What I only wanted to point out by sort of criticizing this so-called various examples of sociological explanations is that as long as the civilization out there is not some sort of hive mind that is effectively controlled by one single mind, we are going to have dissenting opinions and dissenting views and dissenting interests and so on and so on. So I don't think that any kind of lockdown around a certain planet would actually be maintained indefinitely. I don't believe that. And that's why I don't believe in these explanations as reasonable ones. But this is, of course, my own opinion.
It could simply be that they're discrete and difficult to detect, and that's always the way it is, no matter how advanced you get. And that, as you say, it's just too expensive to build these giant megastructures and things like that, and that people just make do with what they have, especially when you get into civilizations. And this was raised in the 1970s by Frank Drake, that if you have a civilization that dramatically extends its lifespan to, say, 10,000 years, then this civilization starts looking for safety, meaning you don't want to die if your aim is to extend life. So maybe you don't go into space. Maybe you just enjoy what you have for as long as you have, and just make do with what's within your means. And that would be very, very difficult to detect. You might be able to see things, hints and things like that, and chemicals in the atmosphere, but even that is destructive. So if they're very averse to anything except living as long as they can, we don't really have a way to see them.
That's a very good point. And this actually brought me to one other thought that I just had. And I'm actually quite surprised that I didn't think about it earlier in our discussion, that our biological bodies are really not meant to be present in the vacuum of space and out there. We evolved to be wonderfully adapted to this particular environment on a planet on our planet. And often people postulate that a really advanced civilization is actually going to be some sort of artificial maybe in a wrong way. I don't want to use that word, but it's not going to be biological. It's going to ditch its own biological ancestry because it's such a bad idea. If this civilization wants to venture into the stars, then maintaining and carrying the environment effectively, carrying your planetary environment with you at all times, so you can just survive, is actually a very taxing, if I use this word correctly, idea. So maybe it is actually at some point much better to create something completely different, like let's call it broadly a machine type body that doesn't require this biological maintenance. And if that is the case, you might not even need for its home of this civilization a classical planetary system. Which means that maybe we do not see them, as you mentioned, to a degree. I mean, I agree with you that maybe we do not see them because we are looking for obvious places, and we shouldn't look in obvious places because a spacefaring civilization might, for example, choose to drift on some outskirts of the galaxy or in some other places which we would otherwise consider completely bad idea to look for life or technological life, just because they are no longer constrained by their own biology. And maybe that's the solution, but maybe that's another solution why we cannot detect such life. Of course, I still believe that if they retained anything of their psychology from their biological times, then they would be interested in the diversity of life. Because this is essentially something that I don't believe, that people for example, they would not care about our existence because we are just another example of the same story everywhere. What life actually taught us, even on our own planet, is that once chemistry becomes biology, then the biology has essentially almost infinite diversity of beautiful things to study and solutions to problems that we cannot even and we couldn't envision before. So I don't believe that any civilization, even this machine one, as long as they retain their psychological inquisitive from their biological time, would suddenly become less enthusiastic or less interested in the surroundings around them. And there are other examples of life, even intelligent or technological, or other planets. They would still study this, even if this was just to catalog it, in their own Excel spreadsheet,
Well, that's exactly what we do. I mean, we have specialists in all kinds of fields, everything you can think of here on Earth, and the anthropologists study every human group on Earth, past and present, and catalog them. Even though it may simply have been a tribe of 5 people, it's still of interest.
Exactly.
So therefore, or the archaeological sites or things like that. Yeah. So if you have an alien civilization that's interested in science, if they've gone that far with curiosity, they probably will go the full way and be curious about everything. Now, and this may well translate over to a machine civilization, but this brings us back to where we began, the galactic habitable zone. If you have such a machine civilization, would it ignore the galactic habitable zone and go out to the outer edges where it can get temperatures, the maximum coldest temperatures, to maximize computation? So does it change if you transition to a machine civilization? Does the galactic habitable zone then dramatically change?
I think yes. I think that the galactic habitable zone doesn't apply. Simply, if you are sufficiently advanced civilization, simply doesn't apply. But of course, this is also a speculation. For example, we might look for advanced artificial constructs around black holes, or even let's look for various. I mean, I do not want to start or suggest a study program of that sort, but who knows? Maybe even rogue planets, the planets that unfortunately got kicked out from their own solar systems. Maybe those are actually somewhat interesting places for having a base or a home world. Of course, for some advanced civilization that long before escaped from its own home planet, biological home planet. I would just say that if you actually have some sort of machine intelligence, you are not bound to planetary environment of any kind. You simply exploit whatever planetary environment and galactic environment you need. And maybe we should ask another question, not where you could live, because I would say that you could live almost anywhere. Of course, not in the interior of the star or so on, or beyond the event horizon of the black hole. But maybe we should ask a question: where would you live? As you pointed this out, where would you live if you were a very advanced civilization? What would be the most beneficial place in the galaxy or in the cosmos in general, where you would set up a main base and look there? And of course, we have limited, our own level of development might be too limited to actually to answer that question reliably. But at least I think that we could ask that and attempt to answer this. And maybe it is something that we should look into. If you were a very, very advanced civilization, where you would actually set up shop, and if you could go anywhere in the galaxy or even beyond galaxy, where would you go? And I leave this question open. Maybe the viewers actually have good ideas where they would go. I have no idea.
And we have to take another break. And when we come back, we are going to tackle a particularly, I'll go ahead and say it, spooky possibility within astrobiology, the idea of a shadow biosphere. Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.